I'm ready now.
Okay.
Do you hear me?
Welcome, Mark. So glad you could be here with us today. I'm very anxious to hear what you have to say about Robert Moses. For the rest of the guys, after completing his PhD at Stanford University, Mark embarked on a career in international business development. He joined COS Incorporated in Palo Alto, California, 1982. Later worked for several years out of the Paris office and retired from their New York office as a senior vice president in 2008. COS is a private firm that provides business and economic engagement development services. Mark has worked on engagements with some of the largest United States and European and Asian companies and governmental agencies, including the French Ministry of Commerce, the City of New York's Economic Development Corporation, and the mayors of Metz and Marseille. He became interested in Robert Moses while working on infrastructure projects in both the United States and Europe. And today we'll discuss some of the major themes, successes, controversies of the Moses period, one of the greatest eras of urban renewal in American history. So Mark, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Stu. I appreciate all your help and your invitation. And gentlemen, I look forward to the presentation and hopefully to having some interesting commentary afterwards. I'm going to share my screen now, and let's see if we can do that. Here we go. And we do slide presentation. There we go. Just so we start at the beginning, Robert Moses, this is his famous photo standing in front of his map of New York in his big office, was called the master builder during his lifetime, because he indeed was a master builder. But one thing that he also was a political master. He could not have succeeded in his building career if he didn't have the political skills to make it happen. Before we look at that career, let's look at how New York City and Long Island would look without Robert Moses. Because when you see all the things he built, it's quite spectacular. 658 playgrounds just in New York City, all these yellow dots that you see all over this map. 2,600,000 acres of parkland. Now this includes New York City, Long Island, and upstate New York. When he started, there were less than 100,000 acres. So you can see, in a way, he was an incredible environmentalist, preserving areas for public recreation that would have probably been developed for housing otherwise. He built 627 miles of parkways and expressways. You can see these on this map. These green areas are parkways. The darker lines are expressways, but pretty much the modern New York, Long Island infrastructure of aerial arteries are all built through his efforts. Every modern bridge in New York, from the Throgs Neck, the Whitestone, the Triber, all the way down to the Verrazano, 13 of them. Dozens of housing developments. So Stuyvesant, Peter Cooper Village in Lower Manhattan, up to Co-op City in the Bronx. And some of the major projects we all know, the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel down here, the United Nations, Shea Stadium, Lincoln Center. He was also actively involved in cultural institutions, both World Fairs, the New York Coliseum, Jones Beach, one of his earliest successful projects, the New York Aquarium, the Park Zoos, as I mentioned, the housing projects, and also upstate, the Thousand Islands Bridge, which connects New York to Canada, the Niagara Power Station, which is still a major power station providing power in New York State, and many, many other projects. So if we look back, how did he get his start? He was born in New Haven, Connecticut, so he's a son of Connecticut. His father was a German immigrant. His mother was a member of a prominent Jewish family of New York City. They moved back to New York City in 1897, where they lived in a townhouse on the corner of 46th and 5th Avenue. So he had a very good upbringing, essentially, with the best education and so forth. He went back to Yale. in 1909, where he got his bachelor's. He was a very high-level student. He won the Math, Latin, and Public Speaking prizes. He was Phi Beta Kappa. He was editor of the Yale Current, the literary magazine. And he was also active in the news publications. And he published multiple articles criticizing barriers to entry for student government. Because he was Jewish, he was not considered for student government. There was a segregation system, essentially, even though he was a very popular guy and one of the best students. He was also a great athlete, member of the Yale swim team, and a published poet, along with some of his other classmates, including people like Sinclair Lewis, who won the Nobel Prize in the 1930s, and Leonard Bacon, who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1941. Moses put together a compendium of Yale verse for the past 10 years. And it's still in print. If you're interested in getting it, you can go to Amazon. Then he went to Oxford, where he got a bachelor's and a master's in jurisprudence. So essentially law and political science. But he also continued his sports activities. He was captain of the swimming and rowing teams, and he was the first ever American president of the Oxford Union Debating Society. He was a good debater. He turned his work there into a PhD at Columbia and into a book published called The Civil Service of Great Britain, which essentially was an advocacy document to reform American civil service, particularly the New York brand of it, based on competitive examinations, educational achievements. And he essentially became a known expert in the area against the traditional Tammany Hall patronage system and graft, which had predominated New York politics for the past 70 years or so. But it's great to be in the academic world, obviously. He had to go into the real world. He did this first in the Municipal Research Bureau. This was basically a think tank to help reform politicians to look at ways to restructure government and things like the civil service. So he developed mathematical models to do that with 16 pay grades and qualification levels. So it was a civil service by merit, not patronage. Obviously, that could create a new kind of caste system. I think we're seeing that today. But at the time, this was novel and very revolutionary. John Purroy Mitchell, a young guy of 34 years old, became mayor. And he was actively involved with this MRB in 1914. And he invited Moses to lead his reform commission. But he had to withdraw his offer when Tammany Hall took segments of Moses's book, which essentially poo-pooed the patronage system, and did a campaign against him, that he was an elitist, that he would destroy jobs, etc. So the boy mayor, as he was called, said to Bob, sorry, we can't use you publicly, but you can stick around and work behind the scenes. While the old guard basically said, don't worry, the boy mayor will be a one-termer. He will not see 4 more years. And they were right. He lost when he ran for re-election. So he was now unemployed. But in 1919, Al Smith became governor. And he had at his right-hand side the most powerful woman in American politics, as she was called. She helped Smith to capture the women's vote. The women got suffrage in New York State before they did nationally, and it helped put him into the governor's mansion. Her husband had headed the MRB, Henry Moskowitz. He told her to hire Moses, that he was a brilliant guy who could help Smith, who was also a reformer, even though he came out of Tammany Hall. So Moses jumped at the chance, and she took him under her wing. She was chairman of this Commission on Retrenchment and Reorganization. He was chief of staff. He did all the research. He put together an over 400-page report, which made all kinds of recommendations, which, although they were not all implemented during Smith's terms in office, they were eventually all done by the time of Herbert Lehman 20 years later. And those are through the things like a 4-year governor's term, because it traditionally had been 2, consolidating hundreds of departments. I think there were over 400 into a much more manageable number of agencies, around 16. These would report directly to the governor instead of be their little fiefdoms on their own, with financial transparency, budgeting, and accountability, and as much as possible, the removal and reduction of patronage. But it looked like he was foiled again. Smith was a one-termer. He lost his second re-election bid. But one thing he learned here from Bell Moskowitz was that you can have all the theories you want and publish all the books you want, but unless you have power, You cannot mandate change. And he really took that to heart and realized he had to get power in order to be able to do the things he saw needed to be done. But he got a second chance with Smith. Smith becomes governor again in the 1923, and this is really the first touch of glory for Moses, where he becomes known to the public. And I like to say that there was another Moses back in the Bible who had nothing on Bob. He had to get God to write his law, but Bob got to write his own. You have to remember that Al Smith was an autodidact who dropped out of school after his 8th grade year. Here comes this consummate genius with language, Robert Moses. And Smith turns to him and says, look, you write the legislation you think needs to be passed, and I will get it through the legislature. So he did that, created a New York State Parks Authority, a unified authority. Before, there were dozens of local state park commissions. They could not issue bonds. They could not get additional financing. So parks were kind of a second thought, an afterthought. And Moses saw this, and kind of oddly, when Smith offered him any position he wanted practically, he said, I want to be the New York State Parks Commissioner, which you would think nobody would really be interested in that job. But he saw it as something he wanted to do. He had this vision, and that could happen because of all these weak park commissions. So in any case, he wrote into the legislation there would be a chairman, a very strong chairman, with a small board with him at the head of it, and a $15 million bond issue with which they could acquire land to build parks and roadways. And that was the first time. At this date now, that would be about $400 million. So it was a significant amount of money at that time. And as Al Smith said, Bob Moses was the best bill drafter we ever had at Albany and wrote all the reorganization bills. This was the first one. There were many more reorganizing state government and these various authorities and commissions that enabled the governor to have more power, but also somebody like Moses who would run these commissions to have power also. And he would do things like put the right words in his legislation. He was very conscious of language. For example, he used parkways instead of highways because there was existing legislation that regulated highways but not parkways. He put into the bill appropriation of public lands by a newly created authority. What he was able to do with this was face down the wealthy landowners on Long Island because he really had no other way of negotiating with them except that he could appropriate land. And he got new financial resources. So he had real power for the first time in his life, and he begins to use it. Early successes, Jones Beach and the Long Island Parkway System. We all know the Long Island Parkway System. Many of you may have been to Jones Beach. At the time, he proposed it to Al Smith, and Al Smith said, you're going to make this this sandbar into a public beach. There's nothing here. There are no roads that go here. All there are these small villages and fishermen. The people are going to say we're wasting their money. And the other thing he said is, you're trying to give them a fur coat when all they really need is flannel underwear. Al Smith was pretty down to earth. So he was skeptical, but Moses told him, don't worry. We are going to build big, beautiful bathhouses, gorgeous parkways with what he called ribbon parks around them, and the people will love it. And indeed they did. Here's the brochure for Jones Beach in the 1950s called An American Riviera. And you see that big building in the background is the bathhouses and the food court and all those kind of things. And this was a novelty in the area. Most beaches had little small wooden shacks, as we still have in many of our beaches here in Connecticut. But this was a truly monumental piece of architecture. Huge beaches, lots of parking for thousands and thousands of cars. And this was enormously successful. So Smith began to realize the voters like this. We need to do more of this. So Moses created, in this case and in many others, what are called authorities. And as this article from The Atlantic in the 1930s states, these are ingenious corporate devices calculated to get things done. The authorities set up by Moses are self-sustaining. They're empowered to issue bonds based on revenue to be collected from tolls or other services rendered. So he was able to get some financial independence because of this. He didn't have to go back to the legislature every year or two to get additional budgets because he was building his own revenue base. And under these authorities, he was able to obtain funding, not just for Jones Beach, but for Southern State Parkway, Northern State Parkway, Wantagh State Parkway, and in fact, the entire Long Island State Parkway system practically, and these ribbon parks which were around the parkways. And this, according to Robert Caro's book, creates a controversy. And I really just want to ask you guys to think about this, whether it's a red herring or a fact. According to Caro, the Southern State Parkway, which was the first road to Jones Beach, has low bridge clearances. You'll see in this illustration, 8.5 feet. So you cannot have buses going through there, and you cannot have commercial trucks going through there. Caro accuses him retroactively of racism and classism, doing this explicitly to keep less affluent and minority bus riders from the beach. Moses fans counter that all parkways, and parkways go back to the 19th century when they were carriageways, but then they became parkways for automobiles, including things like the Bronx River Parkway and the entire Westchester Parkway system, which was before Moses, the Taconic State Parkway, which was under Franklin Roosevelt's chairmanship before he was president. The Merritt Parkway, our own Wilbur Cross, governor in the 1930s, built that. They all have low clearances because their stated purpose is use only by cars, not commercial trucks and buses. And this dates from the 19th century when Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, who designed Central Park, also designed parkways between cities and parks that surrounded those cities. And the whole idea was not to have commercial traffic on them, to keep the natural beauty. Moses did another thing. He built bus stops at train terminus stations and at Jones Beach. So you come out from the city, change from the train to a bus and go directly to Jones Beach. There was also a direct bus from Brooklyn. So there are people who say this is this charge is a little bit over the top, I would guess. To build his first parkway, this is something classic Moses. He ingeniously followed a water supply line that was already under government control, so he didn't have to do so much eminent domain or get the landowners angry. He got plenty of them angry anyway, but he managed to get it done. So now we're in the 1930s, full speed ahead. Moses, the little flower, that's Fiorello LaGuardia right there. The feather duster, that is Franklin Roosevelt. It was a nickname given to him by his mean-mouthed cousin, Alice Longworth Roosevelt, when he was a young guy, and she saw him as kind of flighty. And the Lehman brother, too. Actually, this is the son of one of the Lehman brothers, Herbert Lehman, who became governor when Roosevelt became president. So, do you swear to create shovel-ready jobs? This is actually what LaGuardia wanted. He was swearing in Moses as New York Park Commissioner. Yes, and I also swear I myself can do 12 jobs at once. And we'll see later, he had 12 different titles during this period and others. I don't really like feather duster. Roosevelt and Moses really despise each other. The feelings mutual creep. These are like the behind the scenes thoughts. And then Lehman was kind of the conciliator. Okay, Bob, I'll take you back, even though you kind of piss everybody off. So LaGuardia named him a New York City Parks Commissioner. That was against the law. He could not have a state position and a city position. Roosevelt was against it too, because he didn't like Moses, but LaGuardia got the law changed. So he was able to come into the city and not just Long Island and New York State. At the same time, even though Roosevelt didn't like him, he became the rainmaker of New Deal dollars to New York. Lehman became the buffer between him and Moses, and LaGuardia, who invited him into New York City, was always trying to guard against his reach into housing, because Moses really wanted to get into the housing business, and LaGuardia wanted to keep him out because he had too much power already. But these were two Republicans, LaGuardia and Moses, and two Democrats, Roosevelt and Lehman, who worked together throughout these years. They all had unique gifts. They were a great team. And interestingly, the Lehman and Moses families were nearly neighbors 85 years ago in Germany. They both came from Franconia in Prussia and probably lived like 40 or 50 miles from each other. And here they were again. Truthfully, it's only in America you see things like that. But one thing Moses did in this period, he ran for governor against Lehman in 1934. Lehman was the lieutenant governor under Roosevelt, acceded to the office, and then ran for his own term. But Moses fought him, and he lost in a severe, severe election defeat. He was aloof, arrogant. He didn't really manage retail politics very well. He was great at behind the closed doors politics. But Lehman, to his credit, kept Moses on anyway at his commissions and authorities. They all needed him to have money and funds and the ability to complete those shovel-ready jobs that were needed in the New Deal. And they weren't disappointed. And these are the 12 titles that he held, basically from the 20s through the Depression, World War II, and up through the 1970s. And he extended his power all over the state and the city. He was a Long Island State Parks Commission. We saw that before. The New York State Council of Parks, the New York State Secretary of State under Al Smith's last term, the Emergency Public Works Commission chairman in the 1933-34 period when the New Deal was being launched, Jones Beach, New York City Department of Parks, and the most important one, the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority. That gave him tremendous funds and tremendous cachet because of the success he had with that, and made him a real power in New York for the next 4 decades. New York City Planning Commission, the New York State Power Authority, we'll talk a little bit about that, the New York World's Fair, and finally, late in life, the Office of the Governor of New York as a special advisor. Interestingly, he also wrote the Moreland Commission report and headed that. There was a huge bank failure in New York City at that time in the late 20s before the Depression. So they set up a commission to study why this happened. And he made recommendations that we take as common sense today, such as deposit insurance, independent board directors, financial and accounting transparency. The legislature rejected this, and he warned them there would be more bank failures if they did. And of course, within a couple of years, there were. He was also, after LaGuardia left office, named chairman of the Slum Clearance Committee. This had been around for decades. In 1949 through 1960. This was a very powerful position that allowed you to condemn old slums and replace them with new housing, which helped him very much to do the housing projects he needed to do. He mastered the use of what was called a public benefit corporation. It's a quasi-private entity. It can issue debt like a government agency, but without legislative action. Gave him huge funding opportunities besides the tolls and things that he was charging people. And it's pretty much the way the Port Authority today operates. His empire was built initially on truly transformative open space and arterial roadways and parks that enabled mobility and recreation. They were extremely popular. The elected officials loved them because they saw people vote for them. That is until they weren't. By the late 50s and 60s, investigations they unearthed what some called sweetheart deals, but mostly what people felt were strong arm tactics with the less fortunate. But why did this happen? Well, the incipient automobile era met the New Deal. We have to remember that greater New York City came into being in 1898. The Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island merged into New York City, Manhattan, and the Bronx. And this created a real opportunity for transportation. After all, New York is essentially an archipelago of islands, except for the Bronx, which is connected to the mainland. But New York City, Staten Island, Long Island, which includes Queens and Brooklyn, are all islands. At the same time, mass automobile production, thanks to Henry Ford and many people like him, created a huge volume of new vehicles in New York City and surrounding areas. And the Depression came, and the federal government wanted to fund things that would solve problems and look good. So traffic was the huge problem in New York City. And Moses went at it with great gusto. He employed tens of thousands of workers at the Depression's peak. He built scores of projects, as we saw, all the modern bridges and tunnels, and other types of roadways and parks with federal money. So this was unique at the time. Federal money hadn't been used for these kind of things. And they also created indirect jobs at suppliers all over New York State and nationally. So people really loved him. They saw him as this rainmaker of jobs all over the country. It became so important that over 10% of shovel-ready project dollars from DC ended up in New York. And just to sort of give you an idea of some of the problems they faced, besides the car traffic, there was a railroad that ran up 11th Avenue. And so many people were killed by it, they called it Death Avenue, because there were no railroad stops and things like that. So eventually they put a guy with a horse who would go in front of the train to warn people to get out of the way. And you could see what this kind of multiple traffic did to the city. There's the train, and here's all the traffic blocked behind it. So really the question was, fix the problem. I mean, here's a quote from a guy at Trinity College in Hartford. After a 14-year period in which the number of automobiles in New York City grew by over 650,000 while the government failed to build a single mile of arterial highway, the city was strangling on its traffic by 1932. So Moses came to the rescue. Remember, he hadn't had a city position until LaGuardia, who took power in 1933. So the Triborough Bridge Authority was handed over to Moses. It had been created in 1929, but pretty much nothing had been done because of the Depression. He built that in 3 years. It opened in 1936. It was a cash cow. It was one of the premier projects in the world. With this and other toll roads, he was getting more and more independent financing. The politicians like LaGuardia realized it was a danger to have so much power with one man, but they loved the popularity of his projects with the electorate. Of course, this gave him lots of revenue, power, and clout. He carried around a resignation letter. It became a kind of a joke that if somebody would say, no, we don't want to build that, he would pull out his resignation letter. And none of them, the governor, the legislators, the mayor, would accept it. So he had a growing pot of money, toll revenues, federal highway grants, his bonding capacity with the authorities, and he was able to go full speed ahead. I mean, all the major projects that he did, the West Side Renewal, the Henry Hudson Parkway, the Henry Hudson Bridge, Whitestone, Cross Bronx Expressway, Verrazano, one after another, he didn't waste any time. He really got these things done. And let's just focus on one. Many of these were huge undertakings. This one was certainly no small feat, the Triborough Bridge. 3 bridges make it up, one of the largest vertical lift bridge in the world. Each girder was as big as a 10-room ranch house. It would have to be carried on 4 or 5 barges, pushed by an entire team of tugboats into position. So much concrete was used that entire factories had to be reopened from Maine to Mississippi. Remember, this was Depression. These guys loved him. An entire forest was leveled in Oregon, so lumberjacks loved him to produce the wood to hold the concrete in place. 5,000 men were working on the bridge at any one time, and many times 5,000 men in 134 cities and 20 states who were suppliers for the bridge. It was so impressive that FDR swallowed his disdain for Moses and came to give the inauguration speech in 1936, because it was a feather in his cap too. It showed that the New Deal could work. One of the things that FDR and his brain trust feared was that they would give a lot of money to these cities and it would end up in corrupt cesspools, like Mayor Walker had shown before in the 1920s. He was a very corrupt mayor. He fled to Europe. He was found to have engaged in all kinds of graft and bribery. So when LaGuardia became mayor with Moses as his partner, they were able to show, look, these civil projects really work. We're not going to steal the money. Neither one of them was venal, and it was a huge success. Now, if you look in further in some of the later projects, the Cross Bronx Expressway was started in the 1950s, and it was one of the most complex US roadway projects ever. It was controversial then and still generates controversy. And it went right through from the George Washington Bridge all the way through the Bronx. And as Moses said, when he was criticized, he said, look, you can draw any kind of picture you want on a clean slate, like say Brasilia, which they built from scratch. But when you operate in an overbuilt metropolis, you have to hack your way through with a meat axe. And he pretty much did. I raised my stein to the builder who could remove ghettos without removing people, as I hailed a chef who could make omelets without breaking eggs. And you can see there was blowback from the local population and from some in the press. Generally, His press relations were phenomenal. He was hugely popular with the editors of the New York Times, the Post, etc. He would wine and dine them and make sure his message got out, that he was building something to improve New York City. And indeed, in the end, I think most critics say, well, it did improve not just New York City, but the regional economy. And let's talk a little bit about that. What was the rationale and the ramifications of the Cross Bronx Expressway? Well, the rationale was one objective: to connect I-95. Remember, this was the beginning of the interstate highway era in New Jersey to Long Island and New England. Because once they got over the George Washington Bridge, which was built before Moses came into power and was the main freight artery for New York City and Long Island and east of Hudson, the trucks used surface roads. So as freight was growing, the surface roads were getting completely impassable. So the Cross Bronx Expressway was built to remedy this, giving the trucks and cars that wanted to go through their own highway, essentially. And it was connected to the Bruckner Exchange, the Throgs Neck Bridge, so it could go up to New England and out to Long Island without having to pass through New York City itself. There were many social challenges. There was a forced removal of around 5,000 families, mostly into public housing, and many of those housings were better than they were living in. There was permanent damage to the neighborhood. And there were huge construction challenges. I mean, to even undertake something like this is an incredible project. He had to raise the IRT subway station, tunnel under the tracks while the train still ran, excavate and blast in high population density areas, navigate around existing utilities and pipes, underground, overground, everywhere. And then how to build the Bruckner interchange and expressway once the Cross Bronx Expressway was completed, because that was no mean task either. It's a huge complex of turns and expressway cement. So looking at it in our era, in the 2000s, this is back in 2003. 200,000 vehicles a day with a capacity of 259. I think by now that's pretty much at max capacity. Routinely backed up at all hours, still 6 lanes, you can't widen it. And there's only one good alternate route, the Bruckner to the I-87, which again ends up at I-95. So these two people who studied it for the MIT Center of Transportation had this verdict. Although it was built at great social and financial cost, the expressway was sorely needed locally, regionally, and nationally. It's still a traffic bottleneck, but much better alternative than surface arteries. I mean, New York just could not have grown with trucks going through the surface arteries. It just would not have been possible. Other areas of influence, public utilities we talked about earlier, and housing. He headed the New York the Public Utilities Authority for 9 years. During this time, they built the Robert Moses Niagara Power Station. At the time, it was the largest hydroelectric plant in the world, including the Hoover Dam. It produced more electricity than the Hoover Dam. And it still produces roughly, I think, 20% of New York's electricity, so it's still active today. Housing, and that's not the only one he built. There were others, but this is the biggest and most important. After LaGuardia left office, he got a hold of housing. There was a thing called the tenement problem. It was a hot potato since the 19th century because people lived in what they call old law housing. And that was housing built based on 19th century laws, that you could have outdoor plumbing, you could have limited windows, you could have 4 or 5 story walk-ups where you'd have chopped up into little rooms where hundreds of people would live. And that was a real issue for the modernization of New York City. And he took it in hand. And he used a thing called Title I financing, which was passed by the Truman administration, to directly deal with this problem, not just in New York, but in Chicago, Boston, and other major cities. And it was a way for private investors teaming with government to have the financing to be able to build these enormous housing projects. And that's one of them, the Peter Cooper Village one in Lower Manhattan. But he also worked on a higher end project, the Gracie Mansion. That was just an old museum at the time. The park was just a derelict piece of dirt. He convinced the city council that they should turn it into a mayor's residence and he would beautify the park. LaGuardia lived in a 5-story walk-up And Moses felt this was not proper for our mayor, and he wanted to put him in the mansion, which eventually he finished. And LaGuardia's last term, he lived there. So here's some other areas of interest, but one first comment is something from Robert Caro. It is impossible to say that New York would have been a better city if Robert Moses had never lived. It is possible to say only that it would have been a different city. Robert Caro didn't like the city that Moses produced, but he did things that were pretty interesting. As this Paul Goldberger says for the New Yorker, for every project that ruined the neighborhood, like the Cross Bronx Expressway, there are others, like the Pool and Play Center in Astoria Park, Queens, or Hamilton Fish Pool on the Lower East Side, or the Jackie Robinson Park and Pool in Harlem, that became anchors of their neighborhoods and now designated landmarks. Lincoln Center, whatever you may think of it, jump-started the revival of the Upper West Side. That area was a slum area when he started that project. So these are two of those pools. Moses was a lifelong swimmer. One of the projects with all these problems with all the tenements was that people did not have physical exercise. So when LaGuardia came into office, they built 17 of these things in less than 2 years. And these are not, cheap construction. These are beautiful Beaux-Arts or Art Deco type buildings. Look at this bathhouse. It's quite phenomenal for the era. And they're still around today. He did not get everything built that he wanted. Some notable unbuilt visions. First was the Mid-Manhattan Expressway. He tried to put that through as early as the 1930s. It was a vision where there would be 3 through expressways through Manhattan. One, the Cross Bronx, Manhattan to the Bronx. One, the Cross Bronx, 2, the Mid-Manhattan, and lastly, the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would connect Lincoln Center on the Mid-Manhattan side, the Holland Tunnel, with East Side bridges and tunnels, so they'd be able to go directly to Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island. He got a lot of blowback from these. I mean, the Mid-Manhattan, this was in a major business area, the mid-30s. The businesses didn't want that happening while they were there. And the Lower Manhattan brought to the fore someone called Jane Jacobs. She lived in Greenwich Village. This would affect her neighborhood. And she famously got together a group of people, architects, people in the press that were starting to turn on Moses, and won, defeating him for this project. She said it would destroy Little Italy, Soho, and parts of Greenwich Village, and she was right. Some other unbuilt visions. This is him at Washington Square Park. It's a kind of a cartoon. They call this a park. He tried to build a roadway through the park that would connect Upper Fifth Avenue with Lower Fifth Avenue. So he'd then be able to feed into his Lower Manhattan Expressway. Jane Jacobs and her group complained that it would wreck the park. So he said, okay, let's put it under the park. And again, they said this is going to ruin the topography, et cetera, and she won. Other defeats were the Long Island Sound Bridge. He wanted to build a bridge between Oyster Bay in Long Island and Rye, New York. So the cars would no longer have to go through New York, via, say, the Brooklyn Battery Terminal, up the FDR, and then onto the Brookner, et cetera, to get to Westchester. It was really almost past the legislature, but there was a lot of opposition. Nelson Rockefeller was initially for it, but it never got through the opposition. And it was a very difficult engineering feat also. And again, in the late 30s, he attempted to build a Brooklyn Battery Bridge. Many people wanted the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. He wanted a bridge. He liked things that were visible. And FDR himself got his War Department to say no, it would impede Navy ships going into the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He was right. So Moses got the last laugh. He took over the tunnel project and got the revenues from it. And then the last straws in his career really were the Tavern on the Green and the Shakespeare in the Park and the World's Fair fiascos. The press started getting a little bit snarky with him. There was a problem with the Tavern on the Green restaurant. He had built it in the 1930s. It was operated very successfully by a private entrepreneur. That guy wanted to put a parking lot in a nearby field where mothers and children played regularly. And they found out about it and put together this group, the Mothers of Central Park, and they defeated him. So a kind of a small grassroots effort that stopped him from building this parking lot. But he looked mean. He was fighting women and children. And then there was a second battle of Central Park. This is Robert Caro's term, with Joe Papp. He started Shakespeare in the Park. It was a free theater thing, started in 1954. Anybody who's lived in Manhattan's probably gone to some of those. By 1959, Moses, when he was on vacation, his deputy asked Papp to start charging entrance fees, that they needed money to maintain the area, et cetera. And they wanted 10% of the revenue. But the guy really wanted him out. Papp was politically left. He had been hauled up before the House Un-American Activities Committee. And this guy thought, well, I can get rid of him this way. But he fought back. He had great theatrical skills and PR skills, and he got corporate sponsors. So he basically told Moses to go fly a kite. Moses blacked his deputy, but again, he got egg on his face. And finally, the World's Fair, he was charged with doing this one as he'd done the one in 1939. He had some brilliant ideas to take over basically a dump and rebuild it so that the city could use it after that for housing and things. Anyway, there's a thing called the Bureau of International Expositions that authorizes World's Fairs. He went to Europe where they were and basically dictated to them all the monies that they were going to provide. And he went to each country and said, here's your share, here's your share. And they were really offended by this. So many of them didn't attend. The BIE did not give its blessing to his fair, and it didn't do as well as it was projected to do. So the books were examined. And again, it looked like there was, generosity to friendly contractors, politically connected folks. And not so much to Moses himself. He was not venal. He spent money of his own on these projects, but he was willing to compromise politically when necessary. By 1968, it was really the end of an era, the year the cash cows were really taken away. First, Mayor Lindsay took away some of his New York City titles. Governor Rockefeller wanted him completely out of both the state and city affairs. But Moses had very strong allies, particularly in the state legislature. Finally, Rockefeller decided he was going to merge the MTA and the Triborough Bridge Authority so that he could get rid of Moses that way. But Moses, as always, had a clause in the law which said if the chairman is removed, the bondholders can sue. So Nelson got his brother David, who ran Chase Manhattan Bank, to buy up the bonds and become the agent for the other bondholders. So when Moses pulls out his resignation letter, no one ever accepted it, Nelson. Well, there's a first time for everything, Bob, because my brother will not sue. So it was pretty much the end of his career. He stayed on as a consultant with a title and, perks and things like that. But he was no longer the power broker that he was. He caused a lot of polarization at the time, particularly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, Robert Moses, his critics say, wasn't elected. He had more power than anyone else, and he held it for nearly 5 decades. Moses would not alter his plans for working men, although there are many examples of him doing so under pressure from wealthier landowners. That's true to some extent, and I would say not entirely. He pretty much bulldozed the landowners on Long Island at the beginning. Cross Bronx Expressway was a hugely difficult project, an engineering challenge, but at a very high cost because of destruction of hundreds of buildings, homes, etc. And he designed cities for cars. This is the Jane Jacobs argument. She says there are foot people and car people. She's a foot people. But not for people. The landscaped riverfront highways, miles of asphalt cutting through parks were meant for drivers rather than pedestrians to enjoy. That is somewhat true, but the automotive era created that. The voters voted for this. An opposing view, more recently by Kenneth Jackson and Hilary Ballin, both professors, one at Columbia, the other at NYU, had the city not undertaken this massive program between 24 and 70, had it not built an arterial highway system, had it not relocated 200,000 people from old law tenements. Again, these were disease breeders. They were very sordid in many ways. They had a lot of crime. To new public housing projects, New York would not have been able to claim in the 90s that it was the capital of the 20th century. And Hilary Ballin just states his aim was to strengthen the city center. In other words, people were going out to the suburbs. In an age of decentralization, suburban drift, and urban decay, the beneficiaries were middle and upper class residents, universities, college students, and an economy propelled by brain power. We didn't talk much about the universities, but when he did Lincoln Center, he also facilitated the Manhattan campus of Fordham University. He did a revisioning and revamp of Pace and other university and cultural institutions. So that suburbanites and tourists saw New York as a real draw and a cultural magnet. Caro stimulated great discussion. There's a human truth there. Powerful people become undone by their power. But the book is far from definitive and misjudges history. It's absolutely evident to me that the power broker is symptomatic of a time and a zeitgeist in the community of historians. There's been brewing a sense of discontent. Her point is that Caro wrote this when New York was in decline, and he despised what he saw happening to New York, and he looked around for people to blame, and Moses was kind of the big fish to blame the most, according to Caro. But this is his statue out in Babylon, Long Island, where he retired, and there is now a bill in the state legislature to remove it, which the Babylonians have resisted. But Hilary Ballin, another great quote, "When I read of the heroic building of the 1930s, I brought to mind the stalled projects of our day. It's easy enough now to realize that New York hasn't fallen down, as Caro thought. Look at this resurgent city, it's spectacular." And this was in the 2007 era, when New York really had staged an enormous comeback. Last comment, a reader, if you seek his monument, look about you. When you go to New York City, this is the inscription of Sir Christopher Wren in St. Paul's Cathedral. He was the guy who rebuilt London after it burned down. Fortunately, it burned down, so he was never criticized. He was praised. And interestingly, Moses, when he went to Oxford, studied at the same college as Christopher Wren had several hundred years earlier, and I'm sure was very well aware of the things he had done. And I put in a partial bibliography. I said to Stu, if you want to put this on your website, there's a lot of things to read about him. One, I would encourage people, obviously, if you want to read 1,200 pages, read Robert Caro, or just the intro to that book. And there's also a letter of rebuttal by Robert Moses. It's only about 15 pages. And it goes over the main points of Caro's book and gives his perspective on what was actually happening, because he doesn't agree with Caro, obviously. He's often compared to Baron Haussmann, the guy who rebuilt Paris under Napoleon III, all those large boulevards, the Arc de Triomphe, and all those things. He had very similar characteristics. He was tall, athletic, super intelligent, willing to take charge and run roughshod if necessary. But the big difference with Moses is he was self-made. He had his own vision of how New York and Long Island and New York State could benefit from these changes. Haussmann was basically told by the emperor, this is what we're going to do, you make it happen. It's very American, the Moses story, compared to this one, which is very European. This is one of his poems. It was the one published in the Yale verse book that he edited. I'm not going to go through it. It's about the Mona Lisa. He had a fascination with art, particularly this particular painting. And just one final thought. This is a project I worked on in my career, which has been on the boards now for probably 100 years, to build a cross-harbor rail freight tunnel under the lower Hudson, where it comes out in the port. A new Brooklyn port. It's the best natural deep water port on the East Coast, and terminals to be able to put more of the logistics infrastructure on this side of the river, the east side of the river, because over 70% of the freight that comes into New York goes east of the Hudson. And most of that freight comes over the George Washington Bridge, whereas in other cities, roughly 35 to 40% of their freight comes in via rail. And because we don't have this type of structure, we have all these trucks that not just clog up the Cross Bronx Expressway and the George Washington Bridge, but I-95 all the way up to Maine and Canada. This would remove a lot of these from the roadways and would make our lives a lot simpler and New York a lot safer, because it would have other ways of getting critical medical, food supplies, etc. So thank you very much. I'd love to take questions, and I've enjoyed talking to you.
Wow, that was terrific. What an ambitious guy. So many accomplishments. It's really amazing. Talk about a can-do guy.
Yeah,
it's great.
and it was a can-do era. It was a can-do era.
Yeah.
Not just him. It was a whole LaGuardia and all the people around LaGuardia, Herbert Lehman, Roosevelt, his brain trust, etc.
Yep. So if guys, you want to ask a question, please raise your hands. Ask your question. If you have a second question, essentially raise your hand again, and the system will take care of prioritizing everyone. I don't see any.
I see one, Larry Holtzman.
Hi, Larry.
You're muted.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. I realized it. 2 points. I think the word parkway, by definition, does not allow commercial traffic.
That is correct.
The other thing is, I was driving what used to be the Grand Central Parkway every day during the time of the World's Fair. And one of the benefits of the World's Fair, that was a horrible road, was the expansion of the Grand Central Parkway to, from 2 lanes to 4, primarily in the area of LaGuardia. And I don't think LaGuardia Airport could have ever risen to its current status, or even prior to this new construction status, without that rebuild of the Grand Central Parkway based on the World's Fair. So disappointment, the accompaniments that had to be done to do it made great sense and were a great asset to the city.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Moses did frequently was he would build one project knowing that something like that would have to happen, that the people would demand it, the politicians would demand it, and he would be told, or he would suggest it, hey, we need to expand the roadways coming into it, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you're absolutely right.
Bob Rosenthal.
There we go. Yeah, you referred to the 1930s as the can-do era. I fear we live today in the can't-do era. For example, they're proposing trillions, if you can believe that, of dollars now to be spent on infrastructure. How much of that is going to be spent fighting lawsuits trying to oppose every single piece of infrastructure the country wants to build?
A lot of it, I suspect, because that project I showed you at the end of the slide deck, we worked on that in '99 through about 2002. We had as our client the largest ocean freight and rail carrier in the world. It's an Asian company, who wrote a letter to Mayor Giuliani stating that they would set their headquarters in New York City if this would be built, and they would contribute to it financially, et cetera. He loved it. He went after it gangbusters. When 9/11 happened, they rewrote the same letter to Mayor Bloomberg. He basically put it in the back shelf. We're doing environmental studies then. They're still doing environmental studies on that project now, 18 to 20 years later. It's like, it's a no-brainer for New York City. If not that, something else. I don't care what it is. New York City needs a better way of getting logistics. And they don't let these things happen. I mean, you saw Moses built the Triborough in 3 years. The Cross Bronx Expressway took a little bit longer, but the West Side Highway and the Henry Hudson Parkway and all those things, they were done very quickly. I mean, even in spite of environmental objections. But now what they do is they have continuous environmental studies, which is a very difficult problem. I mean, so you're right. I mean, things will change. The pendulum always swings back.
Guys, just a reminder, questions only, try to avoid political comments. Bob Butke. Bob, where'd you go, Bob? Bob disappeared.
Mute yourself.
Took his hand down. All right, let's go to John Graybaugh.
Incidentally, the cross
Harbor freight line is 100 years old. It was
Yeah.
proposed by the Port Authority in 1921.
Yep, and Mayor Highland actually started digging at that time.
Yeah, and it's taken longer than the Second Avenue subway.
Yeah,
But my question is, I mean, I think many of the criticisms of Moses for the Cross Bronx Expressway especially, you're right, there was no real alternative. On the other hand, if you look at the cumulative effect of the Cross Bronx Expressway, Co-op City, it ended up basically destroying the Grand Concourse, which had been a viable neighborhood, middle-class neighborhood,
right.
and it really bringing it way down. So you have any thoughts on that?
I don't disagree with that. I think it was a terrible problem. It was a Hobson's choice, really, because you cannot have 10,000, 15,000 trucks a day driving through residential streets in the Bronx, right? And on the other hand, you have to get supplies into New York City and up to Westchester and so forth. And the nearest bridge is up in Poughkeepsie. So it's, it was a very difficult choice. And, sorry in a way that it worked out the way it did. But on the other hand, as those guys from MIT say, the alternative was worse.
Bob Budke.
Yeah, I forgot to mute myself. So basically, I grew up as a Dodger fan.
Okay.
And one of the things I read about after the Dodgers had left was that Moses refused to build a new stadium for them at the Atlantic Yards.
Right.
And so they left New York, and the New York Giants left for San Francisco a year later. And so I remember vividly when they lost because they had just won the World Series for the first time.
Right.
A year or two earlier, and 2 years later they were gone. And then I found out that Moses refused to do that. So I just want to hear what your comments are about that, because I do appreciate your. I do know all the other things he did.
Okay, there's a big controversy about that. Walter O'Malley was the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers. As you said, he wanted to build a new stadium in the Atlantic Yards, but he wanted to do it through using Title I, which was a 1949 law passed by the Truman administration to condemn old housing. Unfortunately for him, the things that he wanted to condemn were actually businesses. There was a meatpacking district, there was a terminal for the Long Island Railroad, et cetera, et cetera. And Moses said, I will not use Title I to condemn this because it's illegal and it won't stand up in the courts. And guess what? In the end, the Brooklyn Borough Commissioner, John, what's his name, Cashman, two of the Brooklyn congressmen, Mayor Wagner, all agreed with Moses. And actually the public did too. There's a very interesting article called Revising the Revisionists, Robert Moses and the End of the Brooklyn Dodgers. It's fascinating, quite honestly. It's by a guy named Henry D. Fetter. He's a lawyer and basically an amateur historian, but this won a historian's award that year. And he explains in it that this was not so black and white, that O'Malley was considered the bad guy, say when you were a child, that he left for California, he left his Brooklyn Dodgers fans out in the dark kind of thing. But when Caro's book came along, he blamed it on Moses. But when you look at the facts, the Dodgers were losing seats in their stadium. The fans were not coming anymore to the games. They were moving out to Long Island and Westchester. His peak was in 1947 when he got 1.8 million attendees for home games. But even when he was winning the pennants that he won in the 50s, he was dropping attendance to say 1 million in 1957. And that's the real reason he wanted a new ballpark, because he knew he needed to be on the Long Island line. But in order to be on the Long Island line, he had to move the Long Island terminal. And there was all this stuff behind the scenes politically, but it was all publicly stated. Moses wrote an article in Sports Illustrated in 1957. He didn't shy away from this. Caro kind of gives the idea that he was doing all this behind the scenes. There was a public debate at Gracie Mansion, which included Wagner, the congressman, O'Malley, and all the important key players. And O'Malley essentially lost that debate with the public as well as with the political characters. They didn't feel that they could go to bat to make a private enterprise wealthier than it already was by using eminent domain, and they would have had to spend a lot of additional city dollars. This was not the era where you build giant stadiums based on taxpayers' money.
But he did,
you know,
but he did build Shea Stadium.
he did build Shea Stadium, you're right, which was, you know, a contradiction of that, I agree. But I mean, I feel pity for all the Dodger fans, but on the other hand, they were declining every year. And O'Malley knew that. He wanted to find a way, and he threatened. He said, one year he said, we're going to do our home games in New Jersey. You know, so the fans got kind of disenchanted with him too, I think. But it's an interesting debate.
Thank you.
Gary Gepler.
Yeah, hi. Mark, I believe that Moses offered O'Malley the land that was built at Shea Stadium in Queens. And O'Malley didn't want to move to Queens. I could be
No.
wrong on that, but I think there
I
was.
don't know much about it. I know he was hell-bent on having that piece of land at Atlantic Avenue and Flatbush, I think it was. And that's a residential neighborhood too. But I think O'Malley basically was already talking to the people in California. He saw it as kind of the land of golden opportunity. And he was probably right, honestly. I mean, there's a statement from O'Malley's congressman literally lambasting him as a money grubber. He said, let Walter O'Malley and his stockholders who have no civic pride for Brooklyn, where they made their money, move to the West Coast in quest of more almighty dollars. So yes, he was offered Shea Stadium. I don't think he wanted it. I really don't. Plus it was in Queens, it wasn't Brooklyn.
Right, but that's why, yeah.
Right.
Okay, I don't see any last minute questions.
Yeah, Larry here.
Hi, Larry.
It's ironic, though, that the Barclay Center is now built on what I think is the land that O'Malley wanted to build
Yes.
his stadium.
Times change, don't they?
Yeah.
Well, I remember when I was a child, when I first came to America, we first came to New York, and I had an aunt who lived in, I think it was Foster Avenue, over in Brooklyn, near Flatbush and Atlantic Avenue. And those neighborhoods would have been devastated by something like this. You know, she had come from Ireland back in the 30s or something, and they lived a prosperous middle-class life. And I also remember when, also that same trip, I was like 5 years old, driving down the Henry Hudson Bridge and the Henry Hudson Parkway with my uncle who lived in Yonkers. And before that bridge was there, you had to drive down that steep ravine that's under it and go over like a bridge that could carry 4 cars at a time. So, you know, the difference for the people who lived up in Bronxville and Yonkers and that part of Westchester was enormous. I mean, it was a huge game changer, and also allowed people like him, who he worked on Madison Avenue and advertising, to get to work faster, you know, to have a realistic suburban life, but also be able to work in the city. So it's, I think it was a different era.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much. Truly a interesting and fascinating talk. Really appreciate it. Thank you for spending your time with us. Maybe we'll come back and talk to us about something else, possibly.
I have another one on Fiorello LaGuardia, who's the bookend to Robert Moses.
Oh, maybe we'll see you. Maybe we'll see you in the fall. So again, thanks very much, and I'll turn it back to Joe.
All right, thank you, Mark, also. And I was going to ask a question, but do you think Moses would have been able to do everything he did? And this leads to my introduction of Earth Day and the Environmental Protection Agency that was formed in 1970.
Right.
Would Moses have been able to do a fraction of what he did today in today's environmentally conscious era?
Well, I think the clear answer is no. But I think the other thing you might think about for Earth Day is all the parks that he built.
Oh, no question about it.
People see him as a destroyer. but he was actually a builder. I mean, but today he would, I mean, to do that West Side project, the West Side renewal, where he expanded the Riverside Park out into Hudson River through landfill. I mean, forget it. You couldn't do that today. I mean, you know, it's, and some of the other projects too. I mean, the Triborough Bridge would have had all kinds of environmental studies, you know, so forth.
Even to build a park.
Even to build a small park or a swimming pool.
Again, thank you so much for being with us. A most informative presentation. And as every week, guys, stay safe, stay healthy, be careful, watch yourselves. We're still going through the COVID pandemic. And God willing, we'll see everybody next Thursday.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.